Welcome to the Fairfax Church podcast. We're a community in Fairfax, Virginia, following Jesus. We upload new messages every week, and to learn more about us, visit us at fairfax.cc. Enjoy the message.
All right, well, Jess was talking about our Finish Strong campaign. Let me just give you a little update of where we are. She mentioned our goal is $1.2 million by the end of the year. And as of today, I got this record, this number fresh off the press right before I came in today. As of today, right now, we are at $425,000. Can we just celebrate that? That's good. Now, I know some of you are good at math and you're going, okay, where does that leave us? That means we're about a third of the way, a little over a third of the way there. We have a little over 2 weeks left, and usually the very last 2 weeks are kind of the finish for us in terms of year-end giving. So we are trusting, we are believing that God is going to provide, and if we hit our goal, several things are going to happen. We're going to meet our budget for 2024. We're going to end in the black, which is really important to us. We're going to be able to fill the silos back up, kind of the savings silos that we have. We're going to be able to prepare for whatever it is that God has in store for us in 2025 and to go into that next year with momentum. And we are going to be able to save potentially up to $600,000 in interest if we hit our goal. And so we're praying that God will provide. And as Jess mentioned, every gift matters. And we recognize here at Fairfax, I recognize I've been a part of this place a long time, that we have folks at all different levels of capacity in terms of what you are able to give and what God has entrusted to your care. And whatever that is and wherever you are as it relates to the income, the resources that God has put in your hand, we trust that you will basically take whatever it is that God has given you and that you will give a percentage of that back to him for his work and for his kingdom. We have some folks in the church that have huge capacity and are able to do larger numbers. We have folks that don't have that kind of capacity and they're able to do different kinds of gifts. But whatever it is, like, we are doing this thing together, and it takes everyone together to accomplish what God has called us to accomplish. And so we're going to finish strong in 2024. I am believing that. I believe that God is at work and preparing us for what is going to happen in 2025. Okay, so we're in the third week of our series that is entitled Echoes of the Manger. And as I've mentioned every week, the Christmas story, the reason we call it this is because the Christmas story doesn't just begin at the incarnation. It doesn't just begin 2,000 years ago. It echoes throughout the whole Old Testament. Jesus' birth is the culmination of a love story that began all the way back at creation. It's the celebration of the God who was, who is, and who will always be Emmanuel, will always be God with us. And the first week we looked at the echoes of the manger that we see in the story of Hosea and his persistent pursuing love for his wife Gomer. Last week we looked at the echoes of the manger that we see in Isaiah's plea that God would enter into this broken, sinful world and that he would take on injustice and evil and restore that which has been damaged by sin. And this week, we're looking at a story that we find in 2 Kings. In 2 Kings chapter 4, we meet a woman who has opened her home and her heart to God's presence by welcoming into her home the prophet Elisha. She lives in this little village of Shunem, and we don't know her name, and so the text just refers to her as the Shunammite woman, the woman from Shunem. It would be like the Fairfax woman, the Burke woman, the Centerville woman. It's just the Shunammite woman, the woman who is from Shunem. And today we're going to walk through, a lot of times we do different things in terms of narratives and texts, and sometimes we're looking at points and lifting up points, and sometimes we're just going through the text. Today we're just going to go through the text. We're just going to go through this narrative. It's an incredibly powerful story, an incredibly powerful narrative, and we're going to see what it teaches us about God and what it teaches us about ourselves. And this is how the story begins, starting in verse 8 of chapter 4. One day, Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped by there to eat. And she said to her husband, I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God, is a prophet. So let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table and a chair and a lamp for him so that he can stay there whenever he comes to us. So on the surface, this Shunammite woman seems to have it all. She is wealthy. We don't know where that wealth comes from, but it mentions that she is wealthy, not just that her husband is wealthy and she shares in that wealth, but she is wealthy. She's respected in the community. She has a beautiful home, and she is incredibly generous. And she sees that the prophet Elisha often travels, his travels often take him through their little town. For whatever that reason, he often goes through their little town. And she decides to open history's first Airbnb. Like, this is the first Airbnb. And it's not for everyone. She doesn't post about it. It's like an Airbnb just for Elisha. And the price with taxes and fees is nothing. It's free. It's a gift that she and her husband are giving to the prophet. But even though outwardly her life is incredibly full, Elisha senses, he sees, maybe the Spirit informs his spirit. However, he comes to realize that there's something missing in her life. And so he begins to ask a few questions. In verse 11 and following, it says, one day when Elisha came, he went up to the Elisha room. He went up to the room that they had made just for him and lay down there. And he said to his servant, Gehazi, call the Shunammite woman, the woman who is opening her home to us. And so he called her, and she stood before him. And Elisha said to his servant, tell her, and we're not quite sure why Elisha is not just telling her directly, if this has to do with what's appropriate or there's a language issue. We don't really understand all that. But he says to his servant, Elisha says to him, tell her, you have gone to all of this trouble for us. Now, what can we do for you? Like, you've provided this beautiful place anytime that we need it. And what can we do in return? Can we speak on your behalf to the king? Can we speak on your behalf to the commander of the army? Is there something that we can do? And she replies, it's an interesting response, and it doesn't seem like she's actually responding to what he's saying, but she is. She replies, I have a home among my own people. Now that phrase, I have a home among my own people, was actually a way of communicating, I'm good. I don't need anything. I've got everything that I need. But Elisha can't let it go. And so he continues to dig a little bit deeper. And we read in verse 14 and following, it says, what can be done for her? Elisha asked his servant. And Gehazi said, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. Her husband is old. That's the way that people describe Donna and I. So it's just like, Donna is amazing and her husband is old. And so she has no son and her husband is old. And then Elisha said, well, call her. So he called her. And when he called her, she stood in the doorway, in the threshold between the room where he was and the rest of the house. She stood in the doorway. About this time next year, Elisha says to her, you will hold a son in your arms. And listen to her response, which is very interesting. She objects. She says, no, my Lord, no. Don't mislead your servant. Oh, man of God, oh, prophet. I know you're a prophet. I know you're a man of God. I know you're in touch with God, but do not mislead your servant. But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. Now, Elisha knew that her unfulfilled desire for a child ran so deep that she couldn't even talk about it. She couldn't even express it. It was too painful. It was a pain that she just buried deep inside her. For years, probably, she had wanted to get pregnant, had hopes that she could get pregnant, had not gotten pregnant, and had just come to a point where it's just like, I'm not talking about it anymore, I'm not sharing it anymore, I'm not getting my hopes up anymore, and I'm just burying the pain. I'm taking the disappointment and the pain that I'm feeling, and I'm just burying it. And sometimes we do the same thing. We take our deepest pain and we just bury it. It's not that it goes away, it's just that we're not going to talk about it, we're not going to deal with it, we're just going to bury it. We convince ourselves that it's better just to not hope. It's better to not go down that path. It's easier to not hope. It's less painful to not hope. Because if we hope, we just set ourselves up for more disappointment. And we've experienced so much disappointment when it comes to this that we cannot allow ourselves to experience any more disappointment. And so we know that if we hope, we may be disappointed. And so we say, I'm just not going to hope any further. That's why when Elisha tells her that she's going to have a son, she responds the way that she responds. She says, don't mislead your servant. In other words, Elisha, appreciate you, appreciate what you do. I appreciate that you are a man of God, but don't get my hopes up. I've gotten my hopes up too many times, and they have just been crushed over and over and over again, and I can't go through that again. Some of you maybe have been at that point at some point in your lives. Maybe some of you are at that point with something that's going on in your life right now. It's just like, I can't allow myself to hope. Now, there's this powerful moment in the story where it says that the woman, the Shunammite woman, comes to meet with Elisha. But instead of entering the room that he was in, she waited in the doorway. That's the phrase that's used. She waited in the doorway. It's this little detail in the story that could have easily been left out of the story. You think, why would that little detail be left, in this narrative? But as God's word, inspired by God's Holy Spirit, this became part of the story. This detail got included in the story, that she waited in the doorway. And I think that phrase, that statement, waiting in the doorway, is kind of this image. It gives kind of this image, waiting in the doorway, this image of standing on the threshold between our present reality and God's promised future. Waiting in the doorway is faith mixed with doubt. Waiting in the doorway is trusting belief mixed with frightening vulnerability. Like when we stand in the threshold, when we wait in the doorway, it's like we are between these two realities that are kind of in tension with each other and draw us in very different directions as we wait. As we wait for what is next in our lives. All of us, I think, at times find ourselves waiting in the doorway. Again, maybe that's where you find yourself this Christmas season. Like you're celebrating the miracle of the incarnation. You're celebrating the miracle of God taking on flesh and entering into this world. While at the same time, you're wondering how God's promises are going to be fulfilled in your own life, how God's promises are going to be fulfilled in your own marriage, in your own relationships, in your own family, in your own body, in your own vocation, in your own job, and the things that you are doing. And the list just goes on and on and on. Like you're celebrating the incarnation at the same time wondering the incarnation, which is the fulfillment of God's promise of hundreds and hundreds of years of waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled. And you're celebrating the fulfillment of God's promise while you are wondering how God's promises are going to be lived out in your own life, in your marriage, in your work, in your family. And when Elisha tells the Shunammite woman that she is going to bear a son, her reaction is oftentimes how we react as we're dealing with these kinds of issues in our life. Her reaction is one of awe mixed with doubt. But within a year, she's holding a son in her arms. And I think this part of the story, and this isn't the whole story, we're gonna get to the rest of the story, but I think this part of the story teaches us something really profound, that even when we bury our longings, even when we don't wanna hope anymore, we're afraid to hope anymore because of the disappointment that we may face, even when we bury our longings because we can't bear the idea of having hope that somehow something will happen and then it doesn't happen, or having hope that something won't happen and then it happens. And even when we bury those longings, God doesn't. God sees us. God sees you. Whether you have buried those desires, buried those longings, whether it's something that you can't bear to even allow yourself to hope for, God sees you. He sees us. He sees our desires. He sees our longings. God saw this woman. He saw her heart. And he sees your heart. And he sees your desires. Now, waiting in the doorway doesn't mean that we will always get everything that we long for or everything that we pray for. It means something actually way better than that. It means that God meets us at the intersection of our hopes and our doubts and transforms our lives in ways that we could not possibly imagine. In the story of the Shunammite woman, we hear the echoes of Christmas. We hear the echoes of the manger. Just as the birth of Jesus fulfilled centuries of waiting and longing, her story reminds us that God meets us as we wait, as we long, as we wait in the doorway with gifts of life and grace that often come in very unexpected ways. Now, it would be really great if the story just ended there and it went on to some other story. Here's this woman that had these hopes that she had even buried because she just had been disappointed over and over again, and she'd given up on the idea that she could have a child, and then God provides her a child, and they lived happily ever after. And that's the end of the story. But actually, most stories in Scripture don't end that way. Actually, most stories in Scriptures, there's more to the story. There's complexity to the story. There's nuance to the story. There's layers to the story. And this is not the end of the story. As several years pass, her baby now grows into a little boy. And one day, while this little boy is out in the field with his dad, tragedy strikes. Here's what we read in verse 18. The child grew, and one day he went out to be with his father, who was with the reapers in the field, the harvesters. And the little boy says, "My head, my head." And his father told the servant, "Something's wrong, right? Something's wrong. And carry him to his mother. And after the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, just a few hours, and then he died. And you go, what a heartache. And some of you have experienced loss, maybe a different kind of loss, but loss that just like this is an absolutely devastating loss and just kind of takes your breath away in some way. But for this woman, the son who she never allowed herself even to hope for is taken from her. Now, her response is remarkable in a number of ways. We're told this in verse 21 and following. She went up and she laid her son on the bed of the man of God. This is in that little room on the roof that she and her husband have built so that Elisha has a place to stay when he's on his travels and he comes through the town. She lays him on the bed of the prophet Elijah, on the man of God, and then she shuts the door, and then she went out. And she called her husband and she said, please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to Elisha quickly, so I can go to the man of God quickly and then return. And her husband begins to ask some questions, right? Like, why go to him today? And it's not the new moon. It's not a normal celebration. It's not a religious festival. It's not the new moon. It's not the Sabbath. And her response, she says to him, it's all right. Honey, it's all right. Now, the first thing we notice is that she doesn't tell her husband that her son has died, that their son has died. And we don't know why. We can speculate. We don't know why. Maybe it's because she thought that it would destroy him. She knows him better than anyone else. Maybe it's because she was afraid he would blame himself since their son was with him out in the field when the symptoms started. Or maybe it's just because she knew that he would try to talk her out of whatever it is that she is about to do. But whatever the reason, she doesn't tell her husband that their son has died. She just lays the boy on Elisha's bed, shuts the door to the room, and immediately begins to get things ready to go and to see the prophet. And when she tells her husband that she needs a servant and a donkey so she can go and see Elisha, her husband basically begins to ask her, honey, what's wrong? Like, it's not a religious festival, nothing's going on, you seem to be in a rush, like something's gotta be wrong. What's wrong? Is everything all right? And her response is she says, it's all right. Everything is going to be all right, honey. Everything is going to be all right. And then this is what happens next. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you. So she set out and she came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. And when he saw her in the distance, he could tell something was wrong. So the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, look, there's the Shunammite woman. Run to meet her and ask her, are you all right? Again, same question. Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? And she says the same thing. Everything is all right. She tells the servant, everything is all right. So Elisha sees this woman frantically riding towards him, and he's concerned. So he sends out his servant basically to ask her that same question that her husband asked, are you all right? But he gets even more specific. Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? And her response is the same. Everything is all right. Now, obviously, her son is not all right. Like, her son has died, and it has turned her life absolutely upside down. This is not the future that she had hoped for. This is not the way she saw her life going. And yes, this was the son that she never thought that she could even have. But now that she has her son, she has she sees her future in a different way. She has hopes and dreams for her future that involve her son. And now her world has been turned upside down. So how can she say everything is all right? She can say it because it's a declaration of faith. She doesn't become fatalistic and say, oh, it's God's will that this happened to my son. This is the way that God planned it to be. And she doesn't become cynical and turn her back on God and say, well, if God really loved me, if God really cared, if God really knew what was going on and how much I love my son, something like this would never have happened. And sometimes we think those are the only two options when bad things happen, either fatalism or cynicism. But there's a third option, and we see it in this Shunammite woman. It's what I would call faith-filled waiting. It's waiting in the doorway. It's allowing God to meet us at the intersection of our hopes and our pain. To meet us at the intersection of our faith and our despair. It's saying this thing that has happened is not all right. It's devastating, it's painful, but even in the midst of all of this loss and all of this pain, I know that everything is going to be all right. I know that whatever happens, God is still good. I know that whatever happens, that no matter how dark it gets, that there is still hope. That's the reason that we can walk and we can wait in the doorway. That's the reason we can patiently trust God, even when it does not make any sense, and we cannot make any sense of what's happening in our lives. That's the reason that even in a season of waiting, we can be confident that God's promises are true and his timing is perfect. We can be confident that God will stand with us, bringing light and life and hope. Now, that doesn't mean all of that. Does not mean that as followers of Jesus that somehow we are at peace with loss and death. God is not at peace with loss and death. Jesus died on the cross and rose from the grave to conquer what? To conquer death, to conquer loss. God is not at peace with death. God rails against death. God sent his son into the world to become victorious over death. And for those who follow Jesus, we are not at peace with death either. We too rail against death. But we are at peace with the one who conquers death. We are at peace with the one who is victorious over death. We are at peace with the one who has won the battle over death. That's what we are at peace with. And we see the same thing at work in this Shunammite woman. She doesn't say my son is all right. She doesn't say this situation is all right. She doesn't say this circumstance is all right. She is not at peace with his death, but she is at peace with the God who gave her son life in the first place. That's how in the midst of her loss, she can say, everything is going to be all right. And she doesn't even know the hope of the resurrection. But still, down deep inside, she understands that there is a God who is ultimately victorious over death and loss. And so no matter what happens, if we put our faith in him, everything is going to be all right. Now, in this moment, Elisha, the prophet, the man of God, the guy who went to seminary, the guy who's in touch with God and speaks for God and prophesies for God. In this moment, Elisha has no clue what to do. Like, he has no idea what to do. And the first thing he does is completely wrong. He sends his servant Gehazi to try and raise her child from the dead. And in fact, he sends his servant with his staff. In fact, he says, take my staff and go in the room and tap the staff on the little boy's face. And I think that will take care of things. It's just like, I don't know what he was thinking. It was just like, work for Moses, like the staff, and maybe it'll work for me, but just like, okay, take the staff. And Gehazi does that, and he takes the staff, and he goes to the room, and nothing happens, and he comes back. And here's what's interesting is that even though Elisha is the man of God, the prophet, the one who's gone to seminary, the one who has all the theological answers, all of that, even though he doesn't know what to do, and so he sends his servant to kind of take care of things, this Shunammite woman, probably no theological education at all, like she has this sense that, no, that's not gonna work. And like, instead of going with the servant and going back to her home, she just stays with Elisha. It's just like she's saying to Elisha, he'll be back. And then you'll maybe start to figure some things out, And sure enough, he comes back, and Elisha realizes, no, that's not it. And so Elisha decides to go himself. And here's what happens next. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. And he went in and he shut the door on the two of them, and he prayed to the Lord. And then he got on the bed and he lay upon the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. And he stretched himself out upon him, and the boy's body began to grow warm. And Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, paced back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out upon him once more. And the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. And Elisha summoned Gehazi, his servant, and he said, call her. Call the mom, call the Shunammite. And he did. And when she came in, he said, take your son. And she came in, and she fell at his feet, and she bowed to the ground. And then she took her son, and she went out. Now, there's some things to process in that story that I think are important. The first is this: the reason that God raised her son from the dead is not just so that she would get a little more time with her son this side of heaven. It wasn't just so they could spend a little bit more time together here on earth. That's awesome. That's a byproduct. That's incredible that she got the opportunity to do that. But when you look at it in kind of its whole context, there are all of the rest of the parents that are all around this narrative and this story who also had genuine faith in God, who were also trusting in God's provision, and whose sons and daughters, in some cases, whose sons and daughters also had died. It was not uncommon for children to die. The mortality rate was the death rate was very high. And so there were lots of parents around who had faith in God, had trust in God, whose children had died, and they didn't experience the same kind of resurrection. The reason God raised the Shunammite woman's son from the dead is because God is using this miracle. He's using this miracle to point us to an even greater miracle. The Shunammite woman's story is an echo, again, an echo of the gospel. Like her son, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, died and rose again. But his death and his resurrection didn't just unite him with his earthly parents for a little bit longer or unite him with his friends for a little bit longer. It defeated sin and death. That's what his death and resurrection did. It defeated